Pearl Harbor, the shock that awoke a giant. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii until the sky roared like never before. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, more than 350 Japanese aircraft dove over the American naval base. Within minutes, the Pacific turned into a hell of steel, smoke, and fire. The USS Arizona exploded, the Oklahoma capsized, and in less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were dead. Japan wasn't after a mere tactical victory. It wanted to humiliate a sleeping empire. And it succeeded. But ironically, the strike meant to paralyze the United States did the exact opposite. The flames that rose from Pearl Harbor ignited the spirit of an entire nation. Before the attack, the country still debated whether it should enter the war. After it, there was no debate left. On December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan, with only one dissenting vote. The sleeping giant had awakened. What began as a local tragedy became the ignition point for a global war machine. American factories stirred, assembly lines roared, and ships began to cross the oceans with a single purpose: to strike back. Battle of Midway. Midway, June 1942. A handful of tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by an ocean of uncertainty. Japan, still drunk on its victory at Pearl Harbor, planned to crush the American fleet once and for all. But this time, the enemy knew what was coming. Thanks to naval code-breaking, the US discovered Japan's plan before it even began. It was the perfect chance to turn the tide, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew it. When the Japanese forces arrived, the American ambush was already in place. Within hours of fierce aerial combat, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of the Imperial Navy, were burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. A sequence of names that, until that day, meant invincibility. Midway was not just a tactical victory, it marked the end of Japan's aura of supremacy at sea. The empire that had advanced without restraint was now retreating for the first time. The United States had lost one carrier, yes, but gained something far more valuable: confidence. For the first time, the Pacific seemed winnable. The island hopping strategy. The strategy was simple and brutal. Not to fight Japan on every island, but to leap from one to the next, cutting its supply lines and choking its empire. They called it island hopping. In practice, it was a crossing over a graveyard of coral and steel. Guadalcanal was the first test. Dense jungle, tropical diseases, mosquitoes as lethal as bullets. For 6 months, American and Japanese soldiers fought for every inch of mud. In the end, Japan lost more than ground. It lost time and morale. Then came Tarawa, a small smudge of sand ringed by treacherous reefs. US Marines advanced under withering fire, and many died before they even reached the beach. But the victory was won with blood and courage, showing the world the real cost of each island. And then, Iwo Jima, a black volcano wreathed in smoke and sulfur. There, 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited in tunnels, ready to die rather than surrender. When the American flag rose over Mount Suribachi, the image sped around the world, a symbol of victory and of sacrifice. Each island taken was one step closer to Tokyo, but every step cost thousands of lives. China, Burma, India, the Forgotten Front. Amid suffocating jungles and mountains that touched the clouds, the war in Southeast Asia felt like it belonged to another world. This was the China-Burma-India theater, the Forgotten Front. And yet, without it, Japan could never have been encircled. While Western headlines spoke of Normandy and Midway, here the enemy was as much nature as the Japanese army itself. American pilots, the legendary Flying Tigers, defended China's skies in planes painted with shark jaws, facing forces far greater in number. On the ground, engineers and soldiers carved a path through the jungle to build the Ledo Road, a colossal supply route linking India to Chiang Kai-shek's China. Every kilometer was paid for with sweat, fever, and sometimes lives. But the true strength of this front lay in its silent resistance. Chinese and Burmese guerrillas who together drained Japan's resources in a slow, relentless war. It was a front without glory, but vital to tightening the noose. North Africa Front. The North African desert, a golden sea where tanks moved like warships and mirages fooled even the generals. It was here in 1942 that the United States first tested its army on solid ground, Operation Torch. Alongside the British, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, facing both Vichy troops and Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps. And they quickly realized real war looked nothing like the West Point manuals. In Tunisia, American M3 tanks burned under the sun, and the newcomers' arrogance dissolved into dust. But every defeat became a lesson. General Eisenhower forged his army under pressure, learning logistics, coordination, and above all, humility. When Rommel was finally pushed back into Europe, America had endured its baptism of fire. The army that had come from the factories was now an army that knew how to fight, improvise, and survive. Italian Front. Italy, 1943. Churchill called it the soft underbelly of Europe. But when the Americans and British landed on its beaches, they discovered that this underbelly was made of stone, blood, and mountains. The invasion began in Sicily, sweeping the Axis from the Mediterranean. Mussolini fell, but the triumph was short-lived. To the north, the Germans dug in, fortified towns, and turned the country into a defensive labyrinth. Every hill became a fortress. Every river, a deadly barrier. At Anzio, the American landings stalled for months. At Monte Cassino, an ancient abbey was reduced to rubble under Allied bombs, one of the war's fiercest battles, where every meter was bought with blood. The promise of a quick campaign dissolved into mud, snow, and unrelenting resistance. Soldiers called the advance the staircase to hell. And yet, step by step, they climbed. Rome fell in 1944, but northern Italy burned until the war's final days. Western Europe, D-Day. Normandy, June 6, 1944, the most expensive dawn in history. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel to free occupied Europe. It was D-Day and the sea boiled with ships, smoke, and courage. The Americans faced hell on the beaches of Omaha and Utah. German machine guns tore through the air, grenades exploded in the shallow surf, and the fate of the war hung on every step taken across the wet sand. Many never made it to the wall, but those who did opened the gate to Europe. Behind them, the American war machine moved like a colossal organism. Trucks, tanks, and supplies, all synchronized in an almost industrial rhythm of liberation. French cities began to breathe again. Caen, Cherbourg, Paris, a sequence of names that once again meant hope. By August, the capital was free. Crowds filled the streets, kissing soldiers coated in dust and gunpowder. But the road ahead was still long. Germany was wounded, not dead. Eastern Front, allies by necessity. While the West advanced through France, the real bloodletting of the war was happening in the East. The Soviet Union faced the bulk of the Wehrmacht, and Stalin demanded a high price for the blood being spilled. The United States and the United Kingdom knew one thing: without Moscow, Berlin would never fall. The alliance between capitalists and communists was anything but natural. But survival spoke louder than ideology. American convoys crossed the Atlantic and the Arctic, carrying tanks, aircraft, and supplies to the USSR, the Lend-Lease program. Each voyage was a game of Russian roulette against submarines and ice. In Tehran and Yalta, leaders who barely trusted one another carved up the map of the post-war world. Behind the smiling photographs, suspicion grew. Churchill saw the Soviet advance as a shadow creeping over Europe. Stalin saw Western delays as deliberate moves in a hidden game. But in that fleeting moment, the goal was shared: destroy Nazism. And for a brief instant, the world stood united, not by friendship, but by necessity. Western Europe, crossing the Rhine. The winter of 1944 froze Europe as American forces reached the banks of the Rhine, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. But Hitler still had one move left: the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate counter-offensive, the dying roar of the Nazi Empire. Under snow and silence, German tanks broke through Allied lines, driving them back. Entire towns were surrounded. Yet the Americans held Bastogne, supplied from the air and sustained by a stubbornness the cold couldn't break. When the skies finally cleared, the Luftwaffe was no longer a threat. Allied air power ruled above. A few months later, American troops crossed the Rhine near Remagen, over a bridge that seemed doomed to collapse. It became the symbol of the impossible. The enemy was now fighting on its own soil. With the Western advance and the Soviet siege closing in from the east, Germany was splitting in two. Berlin was in sight, and the end was only days away. The Pacific Endgame, Hiroshima and the Shadow of Victory. As Germany lay in ruins, the Pacific was still burning. Japan refused to yield, and each island taken cost more lives than the last. Okinawa had been the warning: 12,000 Americans dead, 100,000 Japanese. An invasion of the home islands promised a massacre beyond imagination. Then came the decision that would change the century. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The heat of the blasts erased entire cities in seconds. 200,000 lives vanished, and the world entered a new age. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. Absolute silence. The most devastating war in human history was over. But in the metallic reflection of the bomb, mankind saw its own power, and the fear that would follow it forever. The planet exhaled in both relief and awe. For the first time, a war had ended, not from exhaustion, but from the threat of total annihilation. If you've made it this far, I'd like to ask you for something. Don't worry, it won't make your fingers fall off. Jokes aside, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to keep following this kind of content. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. Or if you'd rather, suggest a topic for the next video. See you next time.